Welcome back. Grab some popcorn and drinks, put on your 3D glasses, and make yourselves comfortable. For it's time to count down the final 5 steam-powered stars of the silver screen in part 3 of my top 15 movie star steam locomotives. Number 5. Virginia and Trucking number 18, the Dayton. To start the third and final part of my list at number 5, we now come to Virginia and Truckee 440 American number 18, dubbed the Dayton, built back in September 1873. Now, unlike the other V&T engines on this list, which were built by Baldwin Locomotive Works, the Dayton is one of 2 of the railroad's 5 440s to be built by the Central Pacific Railroad's own shops in Sacramento, California, the other engine being number 17, named Columbus, which was sadly scrapped in 1917. Both of which were built in the 1872 rebuild design for the Central Pacific number 173, which I talked about in my top 20 long-lost American and British steam locomotives. Like the other engines on the V&T, the Dane saw work on the railroad's usual freight and passenger trains, though one of its more regular and dangerous jobs was helping to clear snow from the tracks during the winter months. For this potentially hazardous task, the engine was fitted with a massive wedge-shaped snowplow on the front, had wooden boards fixed on the cab's front windows to prevent snow from breaking them and entering the cab and possibly injuring the crew, and would have 1 or more locomotives coupled up behind it to help with extra pushing power in order to get through the heavy snow. Of course, while performing this duty, it did suffer a few derailments as well as a few scratches and bruises, or dents in its case, but the railroad did have it placed back on the rails and ironed out the damages each time it happened, so as to keep it in regular service. Jump to a few decades later, in the early 20th century, on the 4th of July in 1906, the Dayton had the honor of pulling the first passenger train on the new branch line from Carson City down to Minden. However, after that, the old Central Pacific Bill 440 began to see less and less use on the railroad as the years went by, even after the engine had been converted to burn oil a couple of years later in 1908. By that time, it began to be used primarily for snowplow service during the winter months, practically seeing major use for only about a quarter of a year, but not much other work during the other 3 seasons. But even that eventually came to an end during the winter of 1937, following another derailment while plowing snow in Washoe Valley near Franktown, Nevada. Because of the railroad's heavy decline at the time, they were unable to lift it back onto the rails until the snow had melted in the spring later that year. After that, the Virginia and Truckee decided to retire their number 18 from service and placed a nearly 65-year-old locomotive in storage inside the railroad's Carson City engine house, while number 25 took over its snowplow duties during the winter months. The Dane remained right where it stood inside the engine house for more than a year, with its future looking pretty bleak. That was until September of 1938, when the engine was sold to Paramount Pictures for a price of $1,000. Like the J.W. Boker back in part 2, the Dayton started its movie career first starring in Cecil B. DeMille's Union Pacific in 1939, being featured in a few scenes in the film. Most notably appearing is Union Pacific number 119, in the film's climax depicting the Golden Spike Ceremony at Promontory, Utah on May 10, 1869. Even after its job in the movie was already done, it still wasn't quite finished with its job with the film, as it took on a new role helping to promote the 1939 epic. For this task, the Dane was taken to the Union Pacific shops in Los Angeles, California, where it was changed from its movie look as number 119 to its new appearance as Union Pacific number 58, being given a completely new paint job and a diamond-shaped smokestack. It started off by triple-heading a special train, with Union Pacific's 2, then new, steam turbines built by General Electric, carrying many of the stars from the film for its grand premiere in Omaha, Nebraska on April 28, 1939. Less than 2 weeks before the 70th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Less than 1 week later, it then returned to California to help further promote the film, while also attending the grand opening of Los Angeles' Union Station on May 3rd of that year, where it sat on display at the station platform with Cecil B. DeMille himself and a few other guests, as well as some of the latest Union Pacific locomotives at the time. But it still wasn't finished promoting the film just yet. DeMille then put together Cecil B. DeMille's Union Pacific Paramount Special Train, consisting of the Dayton as old number 58 and a few passenger and freight cars used in the movie. It then went on a 12,000-mile tour across the country, traveling to 30 different cities over the next 15 days, even going as far east as Washington, D.C., being seen by hundreds of thousands of people wherever it went, including former 32nd President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Over the next 18 years up until 1957, the old Sacramento-built engine was featured in a total of 15 movies, including Young Tom Edison in 1940, Nevada City in 1941, Whispering Smith in 1949, and Rails into Laramie in 1954. The Dayton also made a few appearances on television as well, including the 1970 documentary The Ballad of the Iron Horse, and Riding the Rails, The Great American Train Story in 1974, hosted by country singer, songwriter, and train buff Johnny Cash. The old engine also attended a few events as well, including the Chicago Railroad Fair between 1948 and 49, once again dressed up as a Union Pacific engine. In 1969, the V&T's number 18 reprised its role as Union Pacific number 119, this time to help celebrate the centenary, or 100th anniversary, of the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. This included being given a new wooden cow catcher, a smokebox extension, and other components, as well as receiving a new paint job, to make it look as close to the original number 119 as possible. In fact, probably even more so than it did in its film appearance 30 years ago back in 1939. It was then loaded onto a flat car as part of the Golden Spike Expo train and toured throughout the Union Pacific system, being seen by countless many wherever it went. At one point, it even made a stop in Ogden, Utah, where it met up with the living legend itself, Union Pacific number 844. Or 8444 at the time, as well as the new Double D40XD Centennial Diesel number 6900. The following year, the Dayton was then sent up to the still new Golden Spike National Historic Site in Promontory, along with another fellow V&T engine, which again we'll get into later, dressed up as the Jupiter, helping to reenact the famous Golden Spike ceremony. It remained up in northern Utah over the next 9 years, until the two full-scale replicas of the Jupiter and 119 were completed by O'Connor Engineering Laboratories in 1979, after which it was then moved out to its new home at the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City, while it was still under development. Once arriving in Nevada, the old American type was examined for a possible restoration to full operational condition. However, its boiler was found to be in very poor condition, so bad in fact that it would require them to build a completely new one if they were to have it run at the museum. In the end, they decided to go for a cosmetic restoration instead, since they wanted to keep its original boiler. Once its restoration was complete, it then made its public debut on Memorial Day weekend in 1982. Since then, the old Virginia and Truckees number 18 has remained at the museum, being moved between the museum's workshop, main building, and outdoors for many visitors to see. Except for when it was moved out to the Comstock History Center in Virginia City in 2005, where it stood on stag display for the next 13 years, until being brought back down to Carson City in 2018, while V&T 10-wheeler number 27 took its place in Virginia City. Like number 25 and the J.W. Boker back in parts 1 and 2, as well as Dardanelle and Russellville number 8 and the Eureka, the Dayton also took part in the Great Western Steam Up in 2022 to help celebrate the Virginia and Truckees' 150th anniversary, being placed on display alongside the yet-to-be-completed replica of V&T Mogul number 1, the Lion. Following the end of the Steam Up, it was then moved out to the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento for the same duration as the Genoa and J.W. Boker back in Carson City, which was pretty fitting since it was built in Sacramento more than 150 years ago. Also like the Genoa and the Boker, the Dayton is expected to return to Carson City sometime in mid-2024. Number 4. Virginia and Truckee number 11, the Reno. From one Virginia and Truckee locomotive to another, this time being number 11, the Reno, the railroad's first 440 American built by Baldwin in 1872, named, appropriately, after the town of Reno, after the railroad had built up north from Carson City to that town that same year, connecting with the Central Pacific and the rest of the country. Not only was it the first of the railroad's 5 440s, it was also the railroad's first dedicated passenger engine, heading the very first train between Reno and Virginia City on September 15, 1872. The Reno soon became the pride of the Virginia and Truckee, and was given the affectionate nickname of the Brass Betsy, thanks to the shining brass parts that adorned the old Baldwin engine. It spent most of its working life hauling the railroad's passenger trains. One of its most notable jobs was heading the Lightning Express, inaugurated in 1876, which ran between Virginia City and San Francisco, California, jointly operated by the V&T and the Central Pacific. Not much happened with the Reno during its time in service, though in 1877, its engineer at the time, Tom Clark, shot a deer from the train outside the town of Steamboat, which was about halfway between Carson City and Reno, while making another run with the Lightning Express. He then used its antlers to decorate the headlamp of his engine, as seen here in this photo of the old locomotive sometime in the late 1870s or early 1880s, when it was fitted with a diamond stack. Jump 30 years later to 1907, the Reno was also the first engine on the V&T to be converted from burning wood to oil, which also included being fitted with a straight stack. After that, it continued its usual passenger work for the railroad. However, this started to go down as time went on, especially when they brought in their new 460 10-wheelers. Eventually, the old Baldwin 440 was retired from regular service in 1934, but was kept around to be used for special trains and excursions. But that's not all this old engine did. In 1937, the Reno was leased out to Universal for use in their film Courage of the West, which was filmed on the V&T, therefore marking the start of the Reno's career on the silver screen. The following year, the old engine was then leased out to Paramount Pictures to be featured in, once again, Cecil B. DeMille's Union Pacific, along with 3 of its fellow V&T engines, 2 of them of course being the J.W. Boker back in Part 2, and the Dayton in the previous spot. Probably its biggest scene was during the aftermath of a spectacular train wreck caused by a tribe of Sioux Indians, who pulled down a water tower onto the locomotive, causing the crash, which, again, like many other movie scenes like this back in the day, was done using scale models. In fact, a couple of those miniature rail cars used in the movie, a boxcar and a caboose, have been preserved, and can be seen today at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. For this scene, the Reno has substituted for another fellow V&T engine, was placed on the side of the track as carefully as possible using a Union Pacific Railroad crane, and then covered up with debris for the scene. However, after they were done filming this part, and the Reno had been placed back onto the rails, it had sustained some pretty significant damage to its cab, boiler jacket, piping, and running board. Since the engine was leased to Paramount for the film, they had no choice but to transport it to the Southern Pacific shops in Los Angeles for repairs, before returning it to the V&T. However, the railroad still wasn't pleased with what had happened with their number 11, so the studio also had to pay a $5,000 settlement fee as well. After returning to the Virginia and Truckee, the old engine continued to run both charter and excursion trains for the railroad, either running solo or double-heading with other engines. The last time this engine operated for the railroad was in 1943, after which it was most likely placed in storage in the engine house in Carson City, where it sat for the next 2 years, until 1945, when the old Baldwin engine was then sold to Lowe's Inc., which later became MGM Studios, for a price of either $4,500 or $5,000. From there, the Reno's movie career really took off, as it would star in 14 more movies, including The Tall Target in 1951, The Sheep Man in 1958, and How the West Was Won in 1962. The old engine also saw some time on the small screen as well, being featured in several TV shows such as the Union Pacific TV series in 1958, The Texan in 1959, and even The Twilight Zone in 1962. In 1969, the Reno also got to take part in the Golden Spike Centennial celebrations, where it too got to dress up as Union Pacific number 119, while its sibling, number 12, Genoa, was made to look like the Central Pacific's Jupiter. Both engines were then sent up to the still new Golden Spike National Historic Site in Promontory, where they reenacted the famous Golden Spike ceremony on May 10th of that year, the same day that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed exactly 100 years ago. The following year, in 1970, the Reno was then purchased from MGM to Old Tucson Studios, a movie studio and Western-themed amusement park located just west of Tucson, Arizona. Not only was the old Baldwin 440 put on display for visitors to see, it also got to star in even more films and TV shows over the next 25 years. Some of its other roles include Support Your Local Gunslinger and the Gunsmoke TV series in 1971, The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean in 1972, Posse in 1975, The Last of Hard Men in 1976, and even Little House on the Prairie between 1977 and 1979. By 1988, the old Reno began to show its age, which by this point was 116 years old, and was now one of the oldest operating steam locomotives in the country, but needed some major boiler work if it were to continue to run. However, instead of opting for an extensive restoration back to steam, they instead decided to convert the engine to run on compressed air. This was done by having a large diesel power compressor installed in an old baggage car coupled up behind the locomotive, with air being piped to the cylinders, allowing the train to move on its own. Also, that same year, either before or after its conversion to compressed air, the Reno was even shipped overseas to Lucerne, Switzerland, where it was placed temporarily on stag display at the Swiss Museum of Transport. However, by the mid-1990s, the Reno's life would take a very sour turn. On April 24, 1995, an unknown arsonist had started a fire inside one of the buildings shortly before closing time, which quickly spread to other parts of the park. The fire department was soon called in to fight the blaze. However, this proved to be difficult, as there weren't any fire hydrants around the park, and its main water tank stood close to a propane tank. The fire was eventually put out 4 hours later, but the damage had been done. About 40% of the park and studio were lost in the fire, with 25 buildings burned down, several costumes, props, film equipment, and other pieces of movie history completely destroyed, and an estimated $10 million in damage, which would be more than twice that in today's money. To this day, the person who caused this devastating fire remains unknown. Unfortunately, the Reno wasn't spared from the blazing inferno. Much like the Eureka and Reading 2101 mentioned back in Part 2, the old 440 had been severely damaged from the fire, with all of its original wooden parts completely burned to ashes, including its cab, cowcatcher, headlight platform, running boards, and tender frame. Old Tucson was eventually rebuilt and reopened in early January of 1997. However, the Reno remained untouched, still in its damaged state after the fire, until the following year in 1998, when it was given a cosmetic restoration, being given new wooden parts to replace those that had been burned off from the fire 3 years prior, and then was sent out to New Mexico for its last major film appearance in the Wild Wild West in 1999, where it appeared once again as Union Pacific number 119, along with its fellow V&T engine, number 21, the J.W. Boker, as the Jupiter, as I talked about earlier on this list. However, for the Reno scene in the movie, well... Seriously? They restored an antique 1870s-era locomotive that had just been nearly scorched in a devastating fire, only to blow it up for one scene in the movie. Makes total sense. Anyway, after receiving a second cosmetic restoration after that, and even gaining a new sunflower smokestack, even though its tender still retained its 119 livery, the old engine was once again placed on stag display at Old Tucson. And so, for more than 20 years, the Reno just stood where it sat on display, exposed to the hot desert sun. When Old Tucson Studios was closed indefinitely in September 2022 due to low park attendance as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the 1872 Locomotives' fate seemed to be uncertain. That was until August 2021, when the Reno was acquired by Tom Gray, the son of Robert C. Gray and the current owner and manager of the revived Virginia and Truckee, with plans to have the old Baldwin 440 American restored back to its former glory and full operational condition. Not too long after, it was then trucked out to Virginia City, the first time the old engine had ever been there since 1938, more than 85 years ago. The following year, on the 4th of July weekend in 2022, the Reno was brought down to Carson City to attend the Great Western Steam-Up, along with its fellow Virginia and Truckee engines. Albeit without its tender, as it was still up in Virginia City for restoration, which also included constructing a new wooden frame. After the celebration came to a close, the old engine was then brought back up to Virginia City to continue its restoration back to steam. Plans for its restoration include constructing its very own shed, where the Reno will be stored and possibly also set on display for visitors to see when it isn't running, and possibly even getting its own set of passenger cars to recreate the Lightning Express it used to pull back in its glory days on the VNT. It's unknown exactly how long it'll be before its restoration is complete, but I'm pretty sure many can't wait to see this classic American steam locomotive return to service. And hopefully, it won't be too much longer until we see the old Virginia and Truckee Railroad's number 11, the Reno, making its way down from Virginia City once again. Number 3. Great Western Railway number 5972, Alton Hall. Now we come to the top 3 of my top 15 movie star steam locomotives, and to start it off at the number 3 spot, we have the Great Western Railway's Hull Class number 5972, Alton Hall, the only British locomotive on this list. Yet again, not including honorable mentions, and one engine fans of a certain fantasy film series might recognize all too well. As I said in my previous videos, the Great Western Railway of the United Kingdom was best known for its many 460 10-wheelers, with more than 820, divided into 9 separate classes, built between 1902 and 1950 for either express passenger or mixed traffic work. One of these classes was the 4900 class, designed by Charles Collett for mixed traffic work, of which 258 were built at the Great Western's main works at Swindon between 1928 and 1943. They're better known as the Hall class, as they were named after large English and Welsh country houses, or mansions, which were often titled as halls, like for example Toad Hall from The Wind in the Willows. There's also a slightly upgraded version of this class designed by Collett's successor, Frederick Hawksworth, the last chief mechanical engineer for the Great Western. This was known as the 6959 class, or more commonly known as the modified halls, in which 71 were built at Swindon during the latter years of the GWR and the early years of British Railways between 1944 and 1950, resulting in a total of 329 halls. Number 5972, Alton Hall in particular, was built in Swindon on April 30th, 1937. It was first allocated, or assigned, to Carmarthen in South Wales to work on goods and passenger trains, and that's where it stayed throughout its career on the Great Western Railway, up until the first few years of British Railways in late March 1951. During the rest of its time in service on British Railways, the former Great Western Hall was reallocated time and time again to several other parts of the former Great Western system, which by this point was now the western region of BR since nationalization in 1948, until it was eventually withdrawn from service on December 31st, 1963. Upon withdrawal, Alton Hall was first placed into storage at Cardiff East Dock, until being purchased by the famous Wooden Brothers scrapyard on Berry Island in South Wales in 1964. the Great Western 10-wheeler sat there along with several other withdrawn steam engines for the next 17 years, until it was sold to someone named David Smith in 1981, being the 125th steam engine to be saved from that scrapyard. It also became one of 11 hulls to make it into preservation, although 2 of them did become parts donors for new build projects for 2 of the GWR's extinct 10-wheelers. Number 5952, Kogan Hull, with its tender and a few other parts going to the new build Collet 6900 Grange class number 6880, Betton Grange, and number 4942, Mandy Hull, which was completely rebuilt into a new build of Churchward's 2900 Sing class number 2999, Lady of Legend, completed back in 2019. Also, just to add, 7 of Hawksworth's modified hulls have survived as well, though one of them, number 7927, Willington Hull, is also being used as a parts donor for number 6880, Benton Grange, and for the project for a replica of Hawksworth's 1000 County class number 1014, County of Glamorgan. So, with both the original and modified versions, there are a total of 16 hulls today, minus those used for the St. and County projects, with number 5952, Kogan Hull, being planned to be fully restored following the completion of the new build Grange, which will probably also involve either building the engine a completely new tender or borrowing one from one of its siblings. Back to our main subject, after being purchased from the scrapyard, Alton Hull was moved to Horbury Railway Works in Wakefield, most likely being placed in storage. 13 years later, in 1994, the engine was moved again to Carnforth Motor Power Depot in Lancashire, where restoration took place. After about 3 years of work in 1997, Alton Hull had finally returned to steam for the first time in 34 years. Upon returning to service, number 5972 was then painted BR Brunswick green and pulled charter trains along the main line and on a few preserved heritage railways. However, in the early 2000s, Alton Hull made its true claim to fame when it was chosen by Warner Bros. Studios to head the fictional Hogwarts Express in the Harry Potter movies, adapted from the popular book series of the same name by J.K. Rowling. The film series train was made up of 4 or 5 BR Mark I coaches, and were filmed at King's Cross Station in London, where the fictional Platform 9 3/4 was located, the Glenfinnan Viaduct on the West Highland Line in Scotland, and Goathland Station on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, acting as Hogsmeade Station, where the students would be dropped off before making the final leg of their journey to Hogwarts. For its appearance in the Harry Potter films, number 5972 was painted bright red for the fictional Hogwarts Railways, much to the chagrin of Great Western purists, and possibly the jealousy of James the Red Engine, was given a new Hogwarts Express headboard with the Hogwarts School crest, and was fitted with a new set of nameplates that read Hogwarts Castle, after the castle where the namesake School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was located. In fact, because of its new nameplates, a joke was made among rail enthusiasts that the engine was a hull that thinks it's a castle, referencing the Great Western Railway's 4073 class, otherwise known as the Castles, a larger class of GWR 10-wheelers also designed by Charles Collett, built for mainline express passenger trains, of which 8 have been preserved. The engine was even given a new whistle sound for its appearance in the movies, provided by BR Standard Class Pacific number 70,000, Britannia, with the exception of the third film, The Prisoner of Azkaban, where it had a different sounding whistle. Interesting fact, Alton Hull wasn't the first locomotive to be considered for the role of the Hogwarts Express. Around the year 2000, former Southern Railway rebuilt West Country Class Pacific number 34027, Taw Valley, was repainted in the Hogwarts Express red livery and given Hogwarts Express nameplates to help promote the books, most notably the 4th and latest book at the time, The Goblet of Fire, which was later adapted into the film 5 years later in 2005. It was later suggested to be the engine that pulled the Hogwarts Express in the movies, but the director of the 2 first films, Chris Columbus, rejected this proposal, as he felt the large rebuilt Pacific was too modern for the setting of Harry Potter, hence why he decided to go with Alton Hull in the end. Due to its more classic and old-fashioned appearance, the Great Western retained on a majority of its steam engines. Although it didn't get the star in the movies, Taw Valley was later repainted purple with white lining in early 2022, as well as renumbered to number 70 and renamed Elizabeth II, as part to help celebrate the Platinum Jubilee of the late Queen Elizabeth II, or 70 years of her reign as Queen of England. Nevertheless, the Hogwarts Express has since become one of the most iconic and recognizable elements of the Harry Potter films, not only appearing in various forms of merchandise, but also having 5 full-scale replicas of the Wizarding World of Harry Potter at Universal's resorts and theme parks. Now, 3 of them were made for static display in the Hogsmeade areas in Orlando, Hollywood, and Japan. But there were also 2 ride-on versions as part of the Hogwarts Express ride at Universal Resort in Orlando, Florida. In fact, the ride also doubles as a bit of a shuttle service between Universal Studios Orlando, via King's Cross and Diagon Alley, and Islands of Adventure, via Hogsmeade and Hogwarts Castle. Aside from its work with Harry Potter, and even after its final appearance in the final film, The Deathly Hallows Part 2 in 2011, Alton Hall still continued to see use on rail tour trains around the UK, pulling such trains as the Wizard Express, as well as visiting various heritage railways and museums. However, around mid-2024, the magic eventually ran out, as its mainline boiler certificate was close to expiring. The engine ran 2 last Wizard Express trains between Manchester and York on June 7th and July 12th of that year. Sometime after that, its boiler certificate finally expired, and the former Hogwarts Express engine was taken out of service. About half a year later, in January 2015, Alton Hall, as well as 2 of the BR Mark I coaches used in the movies, were loaned out to Warner Bros. Studio Tour London, the making of Harry Potter, to be part of their first expansion depicting Platform 9 3/4, where visitors can see and take pictures of the film series' iconic train, as well as climb aboard and look inside the coaches. The engine and its coaches still reside there on display to this day, until their lease from West Coast Railways expires, though it's unknown when this will be, nor whether or not the engine will return to steam once it does. I like to hope that Alton Hall could be restored back to operational condition, since it's become one of the most recognizable elements of the Harry Potter films, and in turn, one of the most famous steam locomotives in the UK. But whether or not it will return to steam, and wherever it'll go next once its lease is up, the Great Western Railway's number 5972, Alton Hall, will always be recognized by fans of the Harry Potter films, or fans of movies or trains in general, for its most iconic role as the Hogwarts Express. To close this spot with a bit of an interesting fact, Alton Hall, and even Taw Valley weren't the only engines to receive the Hogwarts Express treatment. In late 2021, number 4920 Dumbleton Hall, the oldest surviving member of the Hull class, which was also saved from Bury Scrapyard in 1976, was cosmetically dressed up and renumbered to look like its movie star sibling as it appeared in Harry Potter. The reason why? It was exported in December of that year all the way out to Tokyo, Japan, on long-term loan to Warner Bros. To be part of the new Warner Bros. Studio Tour Tokyo, The Making of Harry Potter, which opened up on June 16, 2023. Also, is it just me, or does Dumbleton Hall sound oddly familiar to that of Hogwarts' headmaster, Albus Dumbledore?
Coincidence? I think not!
Number 2. Virginia and Truckee number 22, the Inyo. As we close in on the number 1 spot, we're now going to talk about probably the most famous locomotive from the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, their number 22, the Inyo, which is also the last of the railroad's 5 440 Americans. Like the Reno and Genoa before it, the Inyo was built by Baldwin in 1875 and mainly saw work on both freight and passenger trains. Not much else is known about the Inyo during its working life on the VNT, other than being fitted with air brakes in 1877, being given a new sunflower smokestack in 1901, and being converted to burn oil in 1910. Also, like the Reno, number 22 was also nicknamed the Brass Betsy. The Inyo was eventually retired from service in September 1926, where it then started to be used as a source of spare parts for the Reno. It remained this way for about 10.5 years, until being sold to Paramount Studios in March of 1937 for a price of $1,250. Not only was this the start of the Inyo's own career on the silver screen, it also became the first locomotive from the Virginia and Truckee to star in the movies, its first appearance being in the 1937 film High, Wide, and Handsome. The Inyo would go on to star in 2 more movies over the next couple of years, Wells Fargo, also in 1937, and The Texans the following year in 1938, before joining the rest of its fellow V&T engines in, yet again, Cecil B. DeMille's Union Pacific in 1939. 2 of its most prominent roles in the film were as Union Pacific No. 41, the engine of the freight train that was attacked by Indians before the Reno took its place in the aftermath scene after the wreck, which, again, was done using scale models, and as the Central Pacific's Jupiter in the Golden Spike ceremony scene near the end, along with the Dayton as Union Pacific No. 119. Like the Dayton, the Inyo also helped to promote the film during the grand opening of Los Angeles Union Station by taking part in a special parade on Alameda Street, with 500,000 spectators coming to see it. After starring in DeMille's Western epic, the Inyo continued to make several more appearances on the silver screen over the following years, starring in almost 30 movies. Some of its other roles include young Tom Edison in 1940, again starring alongside the Dayton, the Harvey Girls, and Duel in the Sun in 1946 with Sierra Railway No. 18, So Dear to My Heart by Walt Disney in 1948, Whispering Smith in 1949, and Rails into Laramie in 1954, both again with the Dayton. Another one of the Inyo's most famous roles was in Walt Disney's The Great Locomotive Chase in 1956, where it played as the Western in Atlantic's Texas, alongside the Baltimore and Ohio's William Mason as the General, as I talked about back in part 2. A couple more movies the old Baldwin engine has starred in include The Last Train from Gun Hill in 1959 and McClintock in 1963, which was also its final film appearance. The Inyo has also made a few appearances on television as well, starting in 1955, its most famous TV role being the engine of the private train of James T. West and Artemus Gordon in the original Wild Wild West TV series between 1965 and 1969. Speaking of 1969, the old 1875 Bill 440 also got to take part in the Golden Spike Centennial celebrations, also dressing up as the Jupiter, like its sibling number 12, the Genoa. The following year, both the Inyo and the Dayton, as number 119, took over the role of reenacting the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory from the Reno and Genoa. This was the first time in more than 30 years that the 2 V&T engines reenacted this event as the 2 famous Golden Spike locomotives, since their starring roles in Union Pacific back in 1939. They continued this role over the next 9 years until the replicas of the Jupiter and number 119 were completed, after which both were sent to their new home at the Nevada State Railroad Museum, in their old hometown of Carson City, Nevada. Upon arriving at the museum, both engines were examined for a possible restoration back to steam. The Inyo was found to be in better shape than the Dayton, so it was chosen for restoration. Work on the old Baldwin 440 took about 4 years to complete, but eventually it finally returned to operational condition and made its public debut on May 29, 1983. Since then, the old Inyo has remained one of the prized locomotives at the Nevada State Railroad Museum, being steamed up occasionally for special events each year, most notably around the 4th of July. It's even gone to travel outside of Nevada a couple of times for special events. First to Vancouver, Canada for Steam Expo, held during Expo 86 in 1986, and then the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento, California in 1991 for Rail Fair 91, held to celebrate the museum's 10th anniversary. And once again, the Inyo also helped to celebrate the 150th anniversary of its old railroad during the Great Western Steam Up on the 4th of July weekend in 2022. But that's not all it got to do. The old engine also got to appear in Chris Eden Green's Steam Locos in Profile in the USA. a special series of episodes he made to help celebrate the 10th anniversary of his series, with the Inyo, along with its other fellow V&T 440s, being featured in the episode that talked about the classic 440 American type. It's also one of only 2 Virginia and Truckee locomotives that are currently in operational condition, the other engine being number 25. Though that'll eventually change following the completion of the Reno's rebuild back to steam, and once the replica of the V&T's number 1, Lion, is also complete. But even so, with all the movies and TV shows this old Baldwin engine has appeared in, number 22, the Inyo will always continue to be recognized as one of the most famous and iconic locomotives of the old Virginia and Truckee Railroad. Before we get to the number 1 spot, it's time to count down this list's honorable mentions. Now, this is going to be a pretty long one, not only due to the number of locomotives in this spot, but also all the movies each engine was featured in. So, with that said, cue the music.
Choo-choo, yeah!
Well, with all that out of the way, we now finally come to the moment you've all been waiting for. The number 1 spot of my top 15 movie star steam locomotives. Sierra Railway number 3. Yeah, you've probably seen this coming practically since the very beginning of this list. When it comes to steam locomotives that have been featured on both the small and silver screens, you just cannot talk about them without mentioning the movie queen herself, the old Sierra Railway 460 10-wheeler number 3. Old number 3 was built back on March 26, 1891 by Rogers Locomotive and Machine Works in Paterson, New Jersey. The same company that also built such engines as the Western and Atlantic's famous General in 1855, the original Union Pacific number 119 in 1868, and Illinois Central 10-wheeler number 382 in 1898, made famous, or more rather infamous, for being the locomotive Casey Jones drove on the night of his last run in 1900. Like some of the other engines on this list, number 3 here didn't start its career on the Sierra Railway, especially given the fact that it was built 6 years before the Sierra Railway was formed. This old star was first built for the Prescott and Arizona Central Railroad, which was also run by Thomas S. Bullock before the Sierra, where it also carried the number 3, as well as the name W.N. Kelly, after the railroad's treasurer. However, old number 3's time in Arizona only lasted for about 2 years, when the railroad became bankrupt and shut down for good in 1893. When this happened, Bullock had the engine, along with the rest of the defunct PC&A's equipment, relocated out to California. When he formed the Sierra Railway, along with William H. Crocker and Prince Andrei Poniatowski, that was when the old Rogers-built locomotive officially became Sierra Railway number 3. While also dropping its old name. The old 10-wheeler played a major role in the construction of its new home railroad, first building up to Jamestown in 1897, then Sonora in 1899, and finally up to Tulum in 1900. After helping to build the railroad, old number 3 then spent the next few years as its primary freight engine. During that time, sometime between 1900 and 1902, it had been converted from burning coal to oil. However, its role as the Sierra's primary freight engine only lasted for about 6 years, when it was taken over by Sierra Railway number 18 in 1906, as mentioned back in part 2. But even so, number 3 still had plenty of work on other freight and passenger trains. Now, old number 3's time on the railroad wasn't entirely without mishap, as it was involved in not 1, not 2, but a total of 3 accidents during its life on the Sierra Railway. Its first accident occurred in February 1898, when it had crashed as a result of a switching mishap, which resulted in the death of its conductor. The following year, in September 1899, its tender had derailed while backing up on the Trestle Bridge, causing it to collapse beneath it. But its third and final accident is probably its worst one of all, when in 1918, just outside of Sonora, it had derailed and turned onto its side, resulting in the destruction of its original wooden cab. Because of this, it had to be replaced with a stronger steel one handed down from a Southern Pacific engine. However, 2 years later, in 1920, things took a much brighter turn for the old engine, as it got to be featured in an old silent movie called The Terror. Not only was this the very first known film appearance for this 10-wheeler, but what no one knew at the time was that this was the start of this old locomotive's biggest legacy. Following its first film appearance, old number 3 continued its usual freight and passenger work for the Sierra Railway. Although, 9 years later, in 1929, it got another chance to appear on the silver screen, when Paramount Pictures chose this engine to appear in that year's film, The Virginian. Not only was it one of the first talkie films, a term used from an early movie to feature sound, to be made outside of a Hollywood studio, it was also the very first film to have Sierra Railway number 3 dress up for the role, mainly fitting it with a box-shaped headlight and large diamond-shaped smokestack to try and give the engine a more period-accurate look. This soon became one of the most iconic looks for old number 3, as it would go on to wear the smokestack and headlight in many of its appearances in film and television, as well as a few other different shaped stacks to change up its appearance. After its time starring in the Virginian was over, the old locomotive once again returned to regular service. However, this only lasted for about 3 more years, as it was officially retired from regular service in 1932, around the time the railroad had entered receivership. Number 3 was placed on a siding near the old Jamestown roundhouse, with the headlight and balloon stack it wore in the movies going over to number 18, and there the old engine sat for the next 13 years. It could have very well been the end for this old iron horse, especially during World War II, when they were scrapping old locomotives as part of the metal drive. In fact, in 1945, during the production of Duel in the Sun, they even considered wrecking number 3 for the film's train wreck scene, which could have completely destroyed the old locomotive. However, the Sierra Railroad's master mechanic, William J. Tremorwan, was appalled at this idea and persuaded the railroad's management to have number 3 restore back the steam for charter service plus possible future movie work, and that destroying it just for the 1946 film was not only ridiculous, but could also cost them greatly in the future. Fortunately, the railroad approved this idea, saving the old 10-wheeler from its fate and resulting in number 18's role in the film, with the wreck scene being done using scale models. The old locomotive was soon moved into the Jamestown roundhouse shops for restoration. A few years later, in 1948, the old engine was back in full operational condition, just in time the Poland excursion sponsored by the Pacific Coast chapter of the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society. In 1950, 2 years after its return to service, old number 3 soon made its return to the silver screen in that year's Western film, Wyoming Mail. Now, there are way too many movies this old engine has starred in for me to name without making this video as long as a full-length film itself. But some of its most noteworthy appearances include The Cimarron Kid and High Noon in 1952, Kansas Pacific in 1953, Rage at Dawn in 1955, The Great Race in 1965, Finian's Rainbow in 1968, Bound for Glory and Nickelodeon, not that one, in 1976, The Apple Dumpling Gang Rides Again in 1979, its only appearance in a Disney film, The Long Riders in 1980, Clint Eastwood's Academy Award-winning film, Unforgiven in 1992, and Color of a Brisk and Leaping Day, its final film made in 1996. Old number 3 also made quite a few appearances on the small screen as well, being featured in such TV shows as The Lone Ranger in 1956, Casey Jones in 1958, Rawhide between 1959 and 1966, Petticoat Junction between 1963 and 1970, where it was best known for its role as the Hooterville Cannonball in the show, The Wild Wild West also in 1963, mainly appearing in the pilot, with the Virginia and Truckee's Inyo taking over its role throughout the rest of the series, The Iron Horse between 1966 and 1968, Gunsmoke in 1971, Bonanza in 1972, Little House on the Prairie between 1975 and 1983, The A-Team in 1984, and The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr. in 1993. The old Rogers-built engine has even been used as a source of sound effects for a couple of animated films as well, mainly providing the train sounds for the 1991 sequel, An American Tail 50 Goes West, and even having its whistle used as the Polar Express's iconic whistle sound in its namesake film in 2004, way back in part 1, when I talked about Pere Marquette number 1225. But undoubtedly, its most famous and iconic role of all was as the Central Pacific number 131 in the 1990 science fiction western Back to the Future Part 3, the final film of Robert Zemeckis' famous Back to the Future trilogy, alongside Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd in their iconic roles as Marty McFly and Dr. Emmett Brown, as well as Mary Steenburgen in her main role as Clara Clayton. For its role as Central Pacific number 131 in the film, it was fitted with a box headlamp and large diamond stack, close to its iconic Virginian stack. a prop would load in the tender, and was repainted with yellow lining, with its cab number painted on both sides of its cab and tender in white lettering. For the scenes when the engine was trying to push the DeLorean up to 88 miles per hour, it was fitted with a few special effects to shoot out sparks, plus the green and yellow smoke from the smokestack to simulate when Doc's presto logs had gone off. Then was later fitted with an exploded dummy stack for the scene when the red presto log had gone off, along with a damaged headlight, red smoke, and other effects to make it seem as though it was falling apart. As for the scene near the end of the film, where the locomotive flies off an unfinished bridge, then crashes and explodes at the bottom of Clayton Ravine, or Sonash or Eastwood Ravine, that was done using a precisely detailed quarter-scale model of the engine created by Industrial Light and Magic, which rolled down a small straight section of track where it crashed through the barrier, plunged off the bridge, then crashed down in the ravine and exploded, using 6 cameras to catch as many angles of the crash as possible. Also, there was absolutely no way they get away with actually using Sierra Railway No. 3 for this scene. Otherwise, they'd probably have to answer to practically an angry mob of both movie and rail fans if they did. Interesting fact, after they were finished with this scene, the only parts from the model that were salvageable after the crash and explosion were its driving wheels, which were then used to help build the No. 7 Oak, a small 15-inch gauge 262 Prairie type miniature locomotive for the Redwood Valley Railroad in Berkeley, California. Another interesting fact about its role in the film was that the real Central Pacific No. 131 was actually a 440 American type that was built in 1868 by Rhode Island Locomotive Works. Aside from its work in the movies and on TV, Old No. 3 has also operated in excursion service for the Sierra Railroad, becoming one of the 6 steam engines the railroad kept after they switched from steam to diesel in 1955. Then later for Railtown 1897 between 1971 and 79, then for Railtown 1897 State Historic Park in 1982 to the present day. These, of course, also included running the occasional double and triple headers with its fellow Sierra engines, as well as a few double headers with Dardanelle and Russellville No. 8 during its time at Railtown as Sierra Railroad No. 8. The old Rogers-built 10-wheeler even got to travel out to the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento in 1991 to attend Rail Fair 91. Coincidentally, around that time, Old No. 3 had turned 100 years old. In fact, about 1 month later, they held a series of special excursions back at Railtown to celebrate its 100th birthday, even though it had technically become 100 about 3 months earlier from that time. However, its time in excursion service and in the limelight eventually ran out. In 1995, the Federal Railroad Administration had set up new safety standards regarding preserved steam locomotives in operational condition, including the infamous 1472 day inspection, as a result of Canadian Pacific No. 1278's infamous boiler explosion on the Gettysburg Railroad that same year. So, in order to comply with these new regulations, Railtown had their star locomotive taken out of service the following year for a complete inspection of its boiler. Initial repairs were completed sometime between 2000 and 2001, with funding for its maintenance provided by the state of California, albeit at a slow pace, which also included completely dismantling the old engine. The project to restore No. 3 progressed pretty slowly over the next 6 or 7 years, until 2007, when a major fundraising campaign was set up for its restoration, which, at the time, its budget was estimated to cost up to $600,000. Old No. 3's status as a locomotive movie star proved very helpful in gaining support for its restoration. But one other major factor was when Clint Eastwood himself wrote a letter appealing for its restoration back to steam, describing No. 3 as like a treasured old friend, as he remembered starring alongside the old engine during its earlier career in Rawhide during the 1960s, then later had it featured in 2 of his own films, Pale Rider in 1985 and Unforgiven in 1992, as mentioned earlier in this spot. Thanks to his help, several donors helped to fund the old steam-powered star's restoration, including the California Cultural and Historical Endowment and the California State Parks Foundation. Restoration for the nearly 120-year-old locomotive was pretty extensive, as it involved boring out its 17 by 24-inch cylinders and having the tires for its driving wheels turned around on a lathe. However, there was a bit of a snag with its rebuild. When they first estimated the budget for Old No. 3's restoration, it was originally under the assumption that its original boiler could be saved. But once they resumed the engine's disassembly, they performed a thorough inspection of the boiler using an ultrasound device, and found it was in very poor condition. Not only from all the excursions it pulled along with its fellow Sierra Railway engines, but also for all the work it had to do for all the movies and TV shows it starred in, therefore making it completely impossible to use its original boiler. To add to that, its old lap seam design made it too costly to have it retrofitted to fit modern standards, as well as put the risk of losing its historical integrity if they were to do so. Because of all this, it soon became quite clear that if they were to return the old movie star back to steam, they would need to build a completely new boiler. The task of constructing a brand new welded boiler was done by Talachi Boiler Works in Camas, Washington, with engineering drawings and other technical assistance provided by the Strasburg Railroad in Pennsylvania. In fact, Railtown 1897 even had No. 3's original boiler shipped out to Washington to be used as a reference for the new one. The total cost for the new boiler was $600,000, coincidentally the same amount the budget for the engine's restoration was originally estimated. Once the new boiler was complete, both it and the original were shipped out to the old Southern Pacific shops in Sacramento, where the locomotive's original frame was waiting. And once the new boiler was fitted on, the engine was then trucked back to Jamestown, where they continued its final assembly. After a few more years of hard work, on July 3, 2010, the old Sierra Railway No. 3 had officially returned to excursion service, completely restored to its 1920s appearance. The final cost of its restoration was $1,600,000, $1 million more than the original estimate for its restoration, but it definitely paid off in the end. Its restoration was later chronicled in an episode of the documentary series Ultimate Restorations in 2014, therefore making it its last appearance on television. Since then, the old No. 3 has operated countless excursions at Railtown 1897, mostly running solo at first over the next 9 years, either pulling 2 passenger cars or a single passenger car with the old Sierra Railway wooded caboose No. 7. But once its fellow Sierra locomotive and movie star No. 28 returned to steam in 2019, the 2 old engines began operating double-header excursions for the first time in years. One of the more notable events Old No. 3 took part in since its return to steam was back to 1885, an annual 4-day event that started in 2018 and lasted until 2023 to celebrate the third and final film of the Back to the Future trilogy, by participating in themed events and activities based on scenes from the movie, as well as visiting locations that were used in the film, which, of course, also included Railtown 1897. This was also the first time since 1996 that Old No. 3 had dressed up for anything, reprising its most iconic role as Central Pacific No. 131. Although, its appearance during these events were slightly different than it originally looked in the movie. Mainly that it wasn't fitted with a box headlight, and it wore a different looking smokestack than the one it wore in the film. It did get to wear its original movie stack for the second time they held this event in 2019, which was usually on display along with the other smokestacks worn by No. 3 and other Sierra Railway locomotives in the movies inside the old warehouse behind the roundhouse, along with many other parts and props used in the movies filmed on the Sierra. It wasn't exactly in the best looking shape, but it was nice to see the engine wear this old stack again after nearly 30 years. Speaking of smokestacks, in 2022, the volunteers at Railtown even recreated the classic diamond stack and box headlight it wore in the Virginian and countless other movies and TV shows, since they wanted to keep the now nearly 95-year-old original as intact as possible. And speaking of 2022, in February of that year, it was initially taken out of service to have some boiler work done, but the volunteers at Railtown 1897 decided to have it undergo its FRA mandated inspection and overhaul earlier than planned, which are still ongoing to this day. I can see why they decided to put their premier engine out of service earlier than planned for its inspection and overhaul, although it did upset one certain arrangement. It was originally planned to appear in Chris Eden Green's Steam Locals and Profile in the USA, where it was to have its own special episode, which would have also made it its latest appearance since Ultimate Restorations back in 2024. However, that changed after he found out it was to be taken out of service early for its overhaul, as he explained in one of his update videos for the series, which resulted in its place being taken by the Reading T1 Northerns and the Chesapeake and Ohio H6 Malays. Hopefully it won't be too much longer until this old steam-powered movie star's overhaul is complete, and is once again back in action pulling excursion trains along some of the lines of its old home railroad. But there is one question that's been playing on my mind. Will we see the old Sierra Railway No. 3 return to the silver screen? It was great to see this old locomotive return to steam after nearly 25 years back in 2010. But for me, and I'm pretty sure a few others as well, the real cherry on top would be if it got the chance to appear in the movies or on TV just like in its heyday once again. I like to think it could be possible, since after being rebuilt with a completely new boiler, it's practically in its best condition yet. Or at least it will be after its current overhaul is complete. Plus, since they recreated its iconic Virginian stack and headlight back in 2022, they could possibly recreate the other smokestacks it wore in older movies, on TV, and even in excursion service prior to being taken out of service in 1996, and possibly even make more smokestacks they haven't made yet to change up its appearance even more. But whether or not it'll ever get the chance to star in the movies or on TV again, all of its previous roles in the past, most particularly in Back to the Future Part 3, will always secure the steam engine's reputation as one of the greatest stars to ever, literally, ride the rails. And they're the main reason why Sierra Railway No. 3 holds the #1 spot of my top 15 movie star steam locomotives. And there you have it, ladies and germs. I hope you've all enjoyed watching me count down my top 15 movie star steam locomotives just as much as I enjoyed making it. Like I said in the opening back in part 1, I wanted to try something a little different than what other YouTubers have done with their top lists on steam locomotives. Plus, not many others have done videos solely on the subject of steam locomotives that have starred in the movies or on TV. Hence another reason why I decided to make this list. Anyway, please leave a comment down below to let me know which of these old film stars of the rails you enjoyed seeing the most, which ones I might have missed, and what movies these old steam-powered stars have starred in are your favorites. Until next time, have a good night, morning, evening, or whenever else you're watching this. Happy railroading, and I'll be seeing you at the movies. So long, folks!